It is only and exclusively thanks to the primary psychosis that we differ from the unipolar autistic people. The nature, millions of years ago, when correcting the anxiety error by means of the primary psychosis, could have corrected it the same way as it is the case of the unipolar people, by extinguishing the anxiety pole of the psyche. However, in the first place, the nature used an indirect, moderate method, the primary psychosis. Since then, the radical method, in form of the complete exclusion of anxiety, is applied only when the indirect method, the psychotic method, does not work. The nature has retained this order of proceeding in the case of long-term exposure to the anxiety, what we will see in this lecture. We observe then in the people suffering chronically from the anxiety disorder a transition from the anxiety disorder to the depression as a complication of the anxiety disorder, because that's what depression is. I repeat, depression is a complication of the anxiety disorder. Indeed, depression is nothing else than a natural mechanism, an attempt to heal the anxiety disorder, the same as when the nature cured the first pre-human apes with the anxiety disorder millions of years ago. Yes, depression is nothing else but the reactivating primary psychosis. To confirm this statement, let's compare the primary psychosis with depression. Thus, both in depression and in the primary psychosis, first of all, we have to do with the stiffening of the psyche. Secondly, in both cases, the emotional shallowing occurs, as we know, and we see it very well in the case of the primary psychosis and basic psychosis, but this is also the case of depression. We can see the shallowing, emotional shallowing, to the emotional zero level inclusive. Thirdly, in both cases, the theatrical external self-esteem is inflated. Inflated? Sounds surprising. The last statement may sound surprising and even shocking, of course, because we are used to thinking that a depressed person has a very negative assessment of oneself, and therefore completely opposite to what happens in the primary psychosis. And this is exactly as we have always believed, and at the same time, it is also true that the external self-esteem becomes distended, as in the primary psychosis. However, there is an important but. Well, in depression, it's the inverted external self-esteem which becomes distended. Just as the bloated external self-esteem is the core of psychosis in the primary psychosis, in depression, the core of psychosis is the bloated external self-esteem, but this time inverted external self-esteem. Thus, depression is a symmetrical, negative reflection of underlying primary or basic psychosis. Therefore, the proper name for depression, attention, is the negative primary psychosis. In the ordinary primary psychosis, we are dealing with a simple distension of the external self-esteem. So it's a kind of a simple psychosis. In the negative primary psychosis, so far called as depression, a complex distension occurs, and such a psychosis is no longer simple but complex. The simple psychotic process of the primary psychosis is only a gigantic bloating of the external self-esteem. The complex psychotic process of the negative primary psychosis, called as depression so far, involves first the psychotic reversal of the external self-esteem, that's the negation of the external self-esteem, and then the psychotic bloating of the reversed external self-esteem. In practice, such a negation and bloating of this external self-esteem consists and presents itself as dramatically excessively poor self-esteem. Thus, fourthly, we are not dealing here with a properly functioning self-critical apparatus, the same as in the primary psychosis. While in the primary psychosis this apparatus does not work at all or work only at a minimal level, in the negative primary psychosis, it becomes so psychotic and through exaggerated and unjustified self-criticism significantly contributes first to the negation and then to the negative bloating of the external self-esteem. Fifthly, both in the primary psychosis and in its symmetrical negative reflection, which is depression, the process of logical thinking is narrowed and trivialized. In both cases, we observe a decrease in the ability to think creatively with the inevitable naivete and immaturity of logical motives. Finally, sixthly, in both cases, there is a tendency to the magical thinking. Thus, we have proved that the negative primary psychosis, known so far as the depression, is a natural reactivation of the primary psychosis, a reactivation forced by the anxiety disorder that persists for a long time. And it has invariably been for millions of years the same mechanism in the psychological evolution of the human species, the reparation mechanism of the error of anxiety, an error from the nature perspective, of course. As I have described before, the nature error, which is the anxiety, first triggers the corrective mechanism in the form of the primary psychosis. When this mechanism does not work or does not work properly, the nature triggers the most radical repair mechanism. It's the definitive extinction of the anxiety pole function. We have already learned about the extinction of the anxiety pole in the case of unipolar psyche, what happens in the so-called so far autism. But we are dealing here with a different mental situation. In the case of a prolonged anxiety disorder, the first corrective mechanism, the psychotic mechanism, is activated. And it is, as we have just shown, the negative primary psychosis, so far called as depression. However, if this mechanism doesn't fulfill its role properly, and the psyche continues to suffer from the anxiety, then the second corrective mechanism is activated, the extinction of the anxiety pole. We observe this phenomenon from time to time by the ineffectively treated patients with the negative primary psychosis. The nature triggers then the second repair mechanism and the anxiety pole stops its activity. All anxiety disappears. Only the emotional pole remains active, so we are again dealing with a unipolar psyche. in contrast to the unipolar psyche that appears in the early development period due to the lack of the primary psychosis activation. Let's call this late development psyche the post-psychotic unipolar psyche because it follows the negative primary psychosis. So far, such a form of the psyche has been mistakenly referred to as the psychotic or melancholic depression. The legitimate question arises why the repair mechanism of the anxiety disorder is not just a normal primary psychosis, but the inverse primary psychosis. After all, the common underlying primary psychosis has always been the anxiety repair mechanism throughout the human evolution. Well, let's not forget in what conditions the primary psychosis appears in the development of the human psyche, namely, when it first appeared by the pre-human apes, their consciousness was still practically a seedling, and yet the nature already triggered a corrective mechanism to stop the suffering of the consciousness. This situation is repeated, of course, every time in the individual development of a person until today. The primary psychosis is activated already at the stage of a starting consciousness. Meanwhile, the anxiety disorder occurs in the adults with fully developed consciousness. First, type 1 humanity people, psychotic, with the consciousness, with the central point and the external self-esteem, these people will never recover from the primary psychosis, and the theatrical external self-esteem will only grow throughout their lives, often reaching monstrous dimensions. It must be so, since the core of the primary psychosis is the psychoticization of the external self-esteem. On the other hand, type 2 humanity, anxious, emotional people, with the consciousness, with the focal point and the anxiety, emotional alertness, who recover from the primary psychosis during adolescence or a little bit later. In these people, it seems that the external self-esteem can only develop in the opposite way than by the type 1 humanity, people, psychotic. Just as the primary psychosis and the lack of anxiety lead to an unrestrained increase of the external self-esteem, the lack of the primary psychosis and the presence of anxiety lead to an unrestrained decrease of the external self-esteem and an increase of the internal self-esteem, of course. Thus, while in the people with the primary psychosis, external self-esteem grows almost spontaneously, the people without this psychosis, that's the type 2 humanity, are doomed to a sinusoid or more or less regular increases and decreases of the external self-esteem, depending on the temporary ratio between the anxiety and the anxiety emotional intelligence. When this ratio shows the prevalence of the anxiety, then the external self-esteem decreases. And when the anxiety is well shielded by the anxiety emotional intelligence, then the external self-esteem increases. Thank you very much.